Welcome back. Tet. Talked a little bit about the attack. By itself, as I said, and I really recommend a close reading of Neil Van Long's article on this, as well as all the other stuff. By itself, I think Tet was really created huge, grave problems for the United States in Vietnam. It was compounded by other particular elements, political and economic at the time. For some time, Wheeler and Westmoreland, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the commander in Vietnam, had been trying to get a significant reinforcement for MACV in Vietnam, and also to get more troops because the strategic reserve, basically the number of troops at home, which could be deployed to meet some kind of an emergency, had been drawn dangerously low. So in April of 1967, Wheeler and Westmoreland had asked for 200,000 more troops and, again, the activation of reserves, and LBJ had turned him down. He had given him about 40,000 troops at the time. This is part of a process which I argue is really political in nature. You keep asking for hundreds of thousands more troops. You keep asking to activate the reserves to mobilize the country for war. And you know LBJ is not going to do it. He's going to nickel and dime you. He's going to give you a little bit of this. You know, he'll give you 20,000 more troops. He's not going to activate the reserves. He may let you bomb a little bit closer to Hanoi, but not in the center of the city itself. So he'll nickel and dime you. And in the end, what you've done by asking him for this stuff is essentially create your own coverage. You know, you've covered your own flank so that later on you can say, hey, we asked this guy and he never gave us what we wanted. We were forced to fight with one hand tied behind our back. This, I think, becomes a major element in Tet. And I think the military very cleverly and successfully plays this. There are many different ways to look at the particular reinforcement request. In mid-February, Wheeler and Westmoreland and others begin to exchange cables talking about requests, and there is some debate as to whether Wheeler or Westmoreland actually had the idea, and a lot of people claim that Wheeler had to give some very clear-cut clues to Westmoreland, basically, hey, make this request. Some people will say that it was actually an attempt to get more troops to fight the war. Westmoreland would claim that as a result of Tet, the United States had the enemy on the run, and they needed these troops to finish it off, to which Art Buchwald wrote a funny satirical column comparing Westmoreland to Custer, with Custer saying, look, we have the Sioux on the run, and if you send me 200,000 more troops, we'll wipe them out, that kind of thing. And people basically said, look, if this is such a great victory, as Westmoreland was claiming publicly, why do you need 200,000 troops to finish it off? Others said it was Wheeler's idea to replenish the strategic reserve, which was very low at the time. I mean, the United States had sent elements of the 101st and 82nd Airborne to Vietnam. So basically, there ain't much left at home. I argue that it's actually part of this political maneuvering that, in fact, by asking for 206,000 more troops, which they do in February, and for the activation of almost 200,000 reserves, 400,000 troops, what Wheeler and Westmoreland did have thrown everything into LBJ's lap. Look, this is what we want, and if you say no, you're responsible for it. And LBJ understands this. At one point he says, the monkey's on my back. Well, he's president. That's where it belongs. He says, I don't want them to ask me for something, say no, and then have all the blame placed on me. Well, that's where it belongs. So I think in a sense that was the point behind it. But the reinforcement request really staggered the country. This becomes a huge political crisis. The front page of the New York Times on March 10th, I think, 1968, says Westmoreland requests 206,000 more troops. At that point, America just throws in the towel, I think, publicly. This is the first time you see significant shifts in public opinion on Vietnam. Basically, everything is kind of becoming clear. They lied about light at the end of the tunnel. They lied about this being a great victory. If it's a great victory, why do they need 206,000 more troops? What has this war become? This started out as, a guerrilla war, an attempt to preserve freedom and democracy. And now, look at this. We already have 542,000 troops in country. They want 200,000 more? And what can they guarantee us with that? Is there any guarantee of victory? No. So the reinforcement request really, I think, brings home in very intimate terms what the war is all about. This is the occasion for Walter Cronkite's report. Cronkite and Wheeler are in Vietnam at the same time. And Cronkite has I think it's called Report from Vietnam on February 27, 1968. Most respected newsman in America. He had been a supporter of the war up to that point. And if you actually listen to it, part of Cronkite's report is actually like any other war report. It sounds like he's talking about the liberation of France during World War II. He's speaking of it as a traditional military battle. But then at the end he says, look, it's time for us to realize that we haven't really succeeded in Vietnam and we really need to start getting out. We've done our best, we tried, but we failed. Right? And LBJ hears this and he says, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And he was right. I mean, clearly the public had shifted as a result of the impact of TED and then of the reinforcement request to ask for this staggering request, and they know they're not going to get it. How can LBJ, you know, under the best of circumstances, LBJ probably, I would argue, certainly was not ever going to give a reinforcement of 200,000 troops and activate 200,000 reserves, under the best of circumstances. But amid TAT, which is really being reported in fairly, you know, not necessarily apocalyptic, but in fairly grave terms, there's no way Westmoreland can do that. There's no way he can come through with that, and they know it. And everyone in the military is aware of that. They're aware that this request is going to shock Washington. And in fact, Bunker, Ellsworth Bunker, the ambassador, tells Westmoreland it's politically impossible. And LBJ himself in press conferences from early February on had said we're at 525,000, 542,000, the numbers kind of vary at different times in February. We're at X number of troops and we don't really think we need any more than that. So it's fairly clear then from the outset of TET that LBJ sees that this is kind of the point of no return. He can't keep going on and on because there's really no guarantee of victory. Westmoreland and Wheeler go ahead with the request anyway. It's turned down, and this essentially creates a real sense that the United States is not going to win this war. We'll keep fighting for various reasons. We're not going to win this thing, and I think it's pretty clear at the time that everybody is now looking for ways to gracefully disengage without making it seem too great a defeat. Side part of that, the part that's probably least known, is that in addition to TED, in addition to the reinforcements, there is a grave global economic crisis brewing. This is something that I talked about in the Reader. And this is not exciting stuff. It can tend to be dry as bones. It's not real sexy. But Vietnam, TED in particular, occasioned a global economic crisis. It had been brewing for some time. Vietnam was an expensive war, costing anywhere from 25 to 30 billion a year probably. The way that the war was accounted makes it difficult to come up with real numbers. In fact, every year Robert McNamara would budget for Vietnam on the assumption that the war would last exactly one fiscal year and it would be over by the end of the fiscal year. So I think the fiscal year at the time was July 30th? I'm not sure. I think it's September 30th now, but I think at the time it was July 30th. So McNamara would budget for the war on the assumption that on July 30th, 1967 or July 30th, 1968, the war would be over. Well, come spring, it's quite clear that the war's not going to be over by July 30th, so he has to go back and get supplemental appropriations. So that adds to the cost of the war. In addition to that, stuff that's on the military budget per se, not specifically allocated for Vietnam, of course, is being used for Vietnam. So all of these things converge. It's real hard to get a beat on how much the war cost. I think it's probably in the overall range of $200 to $300 billion. Someday somebody who has the effort, wants to put the effort and has the expertise is going to sit down and do a very calculated and credible appraisal of this, but it ain't going to be me. All right? It's an expensive war. The war begins at a time, as I said the other day, with regard to liberalism, of great economic growth. The American economy is quite robust. It's had some problems in the early 60s, but by and large it's doing pretty well. Employment is quite high. Employment is somewhere in the range of 4 or 5%. Inflation is manageable. It will continue to go up as a result of Vietnam. The government is running deficits as a result of the war, not surprisingly, because so much is being spent on the military budgets, on the war in Vietnam. As a way of comparison, I think the most ever spent on what could be perceived as social programs amid the Great Society was about $7 or $8 billion a year. Vietnam was 3 to 4 times more than that. Okay? So if you want to call that a war on poverty, compare it to a war in Vietnam, and you see it's just dramatically less funded, dramatically less amount of money being poured into the war on poverty than the war in Vietnam. This occasions some grave economic problems. I don't want to go into the details because, as I said before, this stuff you can't really explain quickly, and I would hope that you would read the articles and it would become more clear. The war also occasions, in addition to, okay, the war will become inflationary. The economy will overheat because the government is spending so much money. Government orders are pouring in to defense-related industries. In addition to that, industries like sectors like construction are doing quite well because of things like housing programs as a result of the Great Society. So employment is fairly strong. The government is spending a great deal of money. Workers begin to ask for wage increases. Prices are going up. This starts to create an inflationary spiral. And so by 66 and 67, there's a significant inflation rate in the United States. This creates problems abroad as well. Something called the balance of payments, which is actually the amount of money that the United States spends abroad in things like travel and tourism and things like U.S. investment abroad, or in this case, specifically military spending. All right, the balance of payments is beginning to also increase dramatically because the U.S. is spending so much money overseas because of the war. So you have inflation and a growing balance of payments deficit. Balance of payments is different than trade. Trade deficit is actually on goods exchanged. Balance of payments is basically everything else, right? Just as with trade, you don't want a deficit. That means that more money is leaving the United States than is coming in. Now, nowadays, with transnationals and globalization, it's not as important. But in the 1960s, national economies mattered more than they do now. And so a negative balance of payments situation, a balance of payments deficit, was considered a detriment to economic growth at home. Right? Inflation, balance of payments. Now, this brings the Europeans into it too as well, because America's economy is inflated, which means that the goods the United States is producing cost more. When they ship these goods abroad, however, foreign governments have to pay the inflated prices. Why? Because under the Bretton Woods system, which we talked about a long time ago, the economy has been established for the entire world based on a dollar. All right? It's a dollar-based economy backed by gold. Okay. An ounce of gold is worth $35. So the pound, the mark, the yen, the franc, the lira, all are based on a gold standard, and they are fully convertible to U.S. dollars. This, because it's $35 per ounce, is a fixed system. Now, if another country is inflating its economy, inflating its currencies, what can you do nowadays to adjust for that? You can revalue your own currencies, right? Under this system, you can't, which means that if another country's currency is inflated, you cannot change the value of your currency. What are you doing? You're paying inflated rates. You're paying for their inflation. The French especially, the British as well, began to increasingly pressure Washington from 1967, 68 especially, that the war in Vietnam was killing them because they could not adjust their currencies, and Vietnam-induced inflation was forcing them to pay much higher rates. That, in fact, de Gaulle put it, that the United States was trying to take over the French economy, that the French were paying for the Vietnam War. This comes to a head amid the Tet crisis. In late 67, Britain had devalued the pound. It's the first industrial country to devalue under the Bretton Woods system. Technically, they really shouldn't have been able to do that, but obviously the British economy is very important to the U.S. economy, right? So Britain devalues the pound, which is a sign that something crazy is going on here. Central bankers are really nervous, right? In late 67, the balance of payment deficit goes up dramatically. It's more than triple the previous year's rate, which means that more and more money is leaving the United States rather than coming back in. Balance of payments problem is bad. In addition to that, because the economy is based on the dollar, the world economy is based on the dollar, a lot of countries are trading in their gold. The United States has gold. It has various depositories, like Fort Knox, right? Foreign countries begin literally sending dollars to the United States, depositing those dollars and coming back with hard currency. This is something you see throughout the 1800s, in various times. I mean, this is not unusual. All right. So the American gold supply, in the 1950s, the American gold supply had been something like $23 billion. By 1968, it's less than half that. So there's a run on gold in the United States. So all of these things are coming to a head in 1968. Balance of payments is getting worse. The deficit's getting worse. Inflation is quite high. And gold is leaving the United States in fairly significant amounts. Right? Amid this, Tet occurs. And Westmoreland asks for 206,000 more troops. McNamara, who comes from the Harvard School of Management, was a businessman, president of the Ford Motor Company, figures that this request for 206,000 more troops is going to cost between $15 and $25 billion. Amid an economic crisis, Westmoreland and Wheeler are asking the U.S. to pump another $25 billion into the war in Vietnam. Okay? LBJ immediately understands what this means. Right? Can't do it. You cannot do it. Inflation is getting too high. The economy is overheating. Payments deficit, balance of payments, deficit is growing. Gold is flying out of the United States. In fact, in March, both of these situations become an acute crisis. In 1 week alone, the balance of payments deficit goes up $300 million. And in mid-March, March 13th, March 14th, I think, the date's not terribly important, there's a gold pool. Various members have a pool where they actually contribute to it. The United States is the biggest contributor. Foreign central banks cash in, I think it's like $200 million, and they withdraw that much in gold. The next day, which is a Friday, which was always the heaviest day of trading, there were rumors that over $1 billion in gold would be withdrawn from the gold pool. In terms of American reserves, this would be well over 10% of American gold reserves leaving the country in one day. That night, Johnson and his advisors get on the phone with central bankers from all over Europe, and they close the gold market the next day. And they call an emergency meeting that weekend. Central bankers from all the industrialized countries except France, which was the biggest thorn in America's side, met Geneva, I think, and basically they restructured the world's gold economy. By itself, this stuff is, fairly obtuse and way out there. Connected to Vietnam, though, I think it's very important. One, the reinforcement request was impossible to meet economically. There is no way that Johnson could have appropriated another $25 billion to the war in Vietnam, especially given how badly Tet had gone. In addition to that, and I think this is really crucial, as Wall Street turns against the war at this point, we can talk, Martin Luther King, incredibly stunning world leader, Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, the anti-war movement. All these people are very important. But their effectiveness can be questioned because there was always a backlash against all of them. Okay? But when Wall Street talks, the White House has to listen. And throughout February and March of 1965, you start to see the tide turn. Wall Street bankers from Goldman Sachs, from Merrill Lynch, from all the major brokerages begin to publicly say, look, we have serious economic problems and Vietnam is the cause of them. This is going to be one of my next books if I ever get around to actually doing the thing, and I've actually begun and done a good deal of research on it. And what's interesting is that at the LBJ Library, you can study Johnson's political advisors, McNamara, Rusk, Rostow, the Bundys. Then you look at his financial advisors, his money people, Secretary of Treasury, head of the Council of Economic Advisors, people like Joe Fowler and Arthur Okun and people like that. And when it comes to Vietnam, boy, they're worlds apart. The political people say, yeah, there's economic problems, blah, blah, and they ignore it, and they go straight on to the war. The economic people from 1965 on are saying, look, we have some serious, grave economic problems, and they're only going to get worse, and it's because of Vietnam. The financial people, the money people, make the link. Johnson's political people or foreign policy people, whatever you want to call them, don't. And Johnson sides with those. Johnson doesn't understand economics. Johnson is, LBJ once said of economists that, well, he did it in his inimitable LBJ style. He said, economics is kind of like pissing in your pants when you're wearing a black suit. It feels good, it gives you a nice warm feeling, but no one really knows anything about it. All right? LBJ. So Johnson doesn't really understand what's going on. He doesn't have a high economics IQ. He just knows that the war is expensive and it's not helping the economy, but he doesn't go beyond that. And his economic advisors are giving him some fairly dire warnings, which he tends to disregard because the economy is doing quite well. I mean, it's actually overheating. Labor's doing quite well. Labor's thrilled with the war. I interviewed Lane Kirkland a couple summers ago. He just passed away this year, who was the head of, well, he was actually George Meany's second in command at the AFL-CIO at the time. Kirkland said, oh, labor had no problems with Vietnam. Why? Because inflation was rising, but so was the cost of living. Most labor contracts had a COLA, cost of living allowance, tied into it. So if inflation went up, their wages went up correspondingly. So they had no problems with it. Government contracts were pouring in. Aerospace industry, construction, vital segments of the economy were doing quite well. The industrial sector really didn't have a problem with Vietnam. But by 1968, far more important in the American capitalist economy in the scheme of things was the financial sector. And financially, Vietnam was draining American reserves. American capital was flowing out of the country, cheaper to invest abroad rather than at home under inflated prices. Gold is flowing out of the country in huge numbers, and if you have a currency system based on a gold standard, then that's not a very productive, healthy thing. So all of these things are converging, and Wall Street really turns tail in '68. William McChesney Martin, I think even to this point still is the longest-serving chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Very powerful man. He was there from Truman to Nixon, almost 25 years, I believe. William McChesney Martin often met with LBJ to talk about Vietnam, and clearly William McChesney Martin was troubled by the war. And in fact, in '68 he goes public. And he, quite a bit at the time actually, not just William McChesney Martin, but a lot of economists were saying, this is like 1929 all over again. What happened in 1929? You're all historians. The Great Depression. Johnson at one point is, quote, daily haunted by the specter of 1929. I think Doris Kearns, his biographer, said that. Johnson himself often goes off on these kind of soliloquies, the dollar and gold are going down the drain, they're going to kill me, the world is falling apart. People think it's 1929 all over again. William McChesney Martin says this is the gravest economic crisis the U.S. has felt since the 1929-1931 period. Guns and butter are not attainable in wartime, which is a fairly damning indictment of a guns and butter economy. Guns and butter economy is great unless you have to fight a war, and then it just doesn't work. This is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board saying this. And I think really the message at that point filters through. We cannot continue this war. It will kill the financial sector. The industrial sector is not balking. But the Wall Street Journal comes out with an editorial against the Vietnam War. The Wall Street Journal had always, been a strong supporter of the war. And now they come out in February and March of '68 against the reinforcement request and basically calling on LBJ to find some way to solve this thing. The financial sector does the same thing. Businessmen, investors, central bankers, European bankers, of course, do too. The CIA puts out a series of reports on how Vietnam is affecting the mark and the yen and the franc. The CIA's economic division. I mean, this is, and no one knows about this. I mean, if you don't read the financial press, you're not going to get this from the mainstream media in 1968. But I think it's far more grave, far more important in the long run, is how this crisis in Vietnam, which has just been heightened because of the Tet Offensive and the reinforcement request, is affecting the American economy. You also see at this point, I think, a shift away from national base to more transnational economies, as it becomes clear that an economy with a domestic basis runs grave risks when crises like this hit. But if the economy is truly global, if barriers are broken down, then it can withstand this. And you start to see after 1968, and especially after the gold shock, Nixon takes the U.S. off the Bretton Woods system, off the gold standard in '71, and then you have the oil shocks, of 1973. Within this 5-year period from '68 to '73, you start to see the transnationalization of American corporations. The number of American banking branches overseas goes up something like 1,000%. The number of American companies with foreign-owned subsidiaries goes up dramatically. The number of foreign companies coming to the U.S. to set up branch operations increases dramatically because, Johnson's people and Nixon's people see the peril of having an economy in mid-wartime that has this kind of a domestic basis, right? Read the articles, more closely because I think those spell it out more clearly. This is a fairly quick synopsis of it. Hey, to me, it's not exciting stuff, but I think this is the real story of Tet. In the long run, it's far more important than what's actually happening on the ground in Vietnam. Wall Street, in the end, has an authority beyond that of many other segments of American society. And LBJ finally cannot avoid it any longer. This is something his people have been warning him about, his financial people. I mean, in a sense, the chickens we're coming home to roost. And this is what William McChesney Martin said. He was really kind of in your face about it publicly. And the chair of the Fed doesn't do that kind of thing that often. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, how important do you think Clark Clifford is as an advisor in this
it's not
respect?
Clifford, I'm glad you brought that up. Clifford really is credited in a sense with de-escalation because McNamara resigns. He's forced out. He's on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And so Clark Clifford replaces him. Clifford is always portrayed as an old Democratic Party stalwart. He had helped Truman. He was an old lawyer. He was an operator. What else was Clark Clifford? Huh? Well, he wasn't an economist, but he was an insider. This guy had contacts throughout Wall Street. And in fact, he ended his life while being implicated, at the end of his life, he was implicated deeply in the, he was on trial, in fact, was it BCCI, right? I mean, this guy was an insider in the banking industry, right? And Clifford does this basically reevaluation. It's called an A to Z reassessment of the war. And Clifford says, look, this reinforcement is foolish, the war is going badly, so on and so forth. Clifford doesn't say, but has to be at the forefront of saying, this thing's killing us, because this man has clear contacts. He's very well connected to Wall Street. He understands the way the economy works far more than LBJ does. McNamara should have. Rostow thought he was the economist of the Cold War, but Rostow never really got it either. But I think Clifford does see the connections there. Now, Clifford never explicitly said, look, the dollar is killing us, this gold crisis is getting out of hand, and so on and so forth. But people see it coming. I think Clifford really does demonstrate that. This kind of unspoken idea that economically we can't keep this going anymore. And I would argue that's the reason for de-escalation after Tet, the reason that the U.S. essentially doesn't throw in the towel, but clearly realizes that it's a different ballgame now. Yeah.
I asked that because in his memoirs, he is actually pretty explicit.
Yeah,
because,
in his memoirs he is.
Basically says,
Yeah.
I took a sounding from the business sector, and they were not optimistic.
At the time, you didn't. This was kind of unspoken at the time, and later on, I did use Clifford's memoirs. Actually, Clifford is fairly candid. I think Clifford also, he never came out and said it. I think Clifford, in a sense, also would buy into the idea that the reinforcement request was kind of a setup. That in fact, I think at one point he says the minuet was taking place as to who would ask and who would turn him down. It was, he compares it like courting a young girl or something like that. Or I think it was him. Maybe it was someone else. Yeah. Yeah, right. And that came out toward the end. But that's really the first time he talked about that in depth, and you don't see it in the documents. Now, the National Security Council actually prepared a major study on the gold crisis, so it was clearly forefront at the time, but it was not publicly addressed. Mostly because basically people thought, well, the American people will never understand this esoteric, kind of economic stuff anyway. And in addition to that, we don't want them to think Wall Street is calling the shots. This also, I think, really shows the primacy of finance capital over industrial capital, because industrial capital was doing quite well. I mean, the orders were coming in, aerospace was doing well, defense-related industries were doing well, construction was doing quite well. Brown and Root were doing damn well as a result of the Vietnam War, but Wall Street was more important, and this is kind of a work in progress, But the more I do it, I mean, it strikes me. It's just this is really a defining event in post-war America. I think this is the point at which the kind of American century, this great American power, this hegemony after World War II, really starts to boom. You start to see it dissipate because of Vietnam. It's tremendously important.
Did LBJ have a connection with Brown and Root?
Yeah, he was their president. Oh, okay. Just like he was all of our president, right? Yeah. Yes, he did. Actually, the best, I think, source I've seen on that is Lloyd Gardner's book, Pay Any Price. At the beginning of it, he spends a good deal of time talking about Johnson's Texas roots, and he brings Brown and Root into it. Brown and Root, and it's a private company, so you'll never see any of their documents, but they did quite well. They built South Vietnam. I mean, it was Brown and Root, kind of South Vietnam brought to you by Brown and Root in large measure. So industrial, I think, American companies, American labor was doing well as a result of the Vietnam War. Financially, it wasn't, and this is really important. I think you really see a break here. I mean, I would argue that finance capital was always more important anyway, but you really see it in 1968, all right? So that's the economic crisis. What's the legacy? Tet, I think, is still today, the defining event. Whenever you talk about Vietnam, you're going to see Tet come front and center. It's seen as kind of a metaphor for the entire war. It speaks to so many different things. Insurgency versus conventional warfare, the role of the media, the role of the anti-war movement, the volatility of public opinion. You know, just as Americans would say, well, we actually wanted Tet, but Walter Cronkite or, you know, the media kind of took the victory away, or we were forced to fight with one hand tied behind our back. Those are kind of metaphors for the entire war. So the legacy of Tet, I think, in fact, is that for most people it was a great victory. I mean, when I was doing this, I surveyed the literature, and with only a few exceptions, the vast majority of authors, whether they be liberal or conservative, agreed with the idea that Tet was a great military victory, but a psychological defeat. Now, some of them said that's a good thing. I think this doesn't work on many different levels. For one thing, to separate these is really counterproductive. I've said this before, people don't compartmentalize their thinking. We're going to fight the political war, we're going to fight the military war, and so forth. In fact, the fact that the U.S. did that, I think, really was indicative of the problems they had in Vietnam. You know, Bonaparte, Napoleon said, you know, war is essentially 90% morale, the mental part of it. And clearly, in the case of Vietnam, that's quite clear. I mean, Vietnamese were seriously outgunned. The Vietnamese enemy seriously outgunned by both the United States and the ARVN, and yet they won the war. Why? I would argue because they were far more dedicated. People will say it's because they used coercion and force. Well, what's more coercive than a B-52? Yet the Vietnamese won the war, you know, because I think their morale was much important. So to say military victory, political or psychological defeat, that doesn't mean anything. In particular, because that's what war is. War isn't just shooting guns at each other. It's having people who are dedicated, who are willing to sacrifice, who will keep fighting, who will, you know, retreat, regroup, and come back again. And during Tet, that I think became quite clear. So on one hand, to say that, you know, military victory, political defeat, well, what's that mean? There's actually a good book by an Army major, I believe, Andrew Krapinovich. It's called The Army in Vietnam. And Krapinovich makes the same point that, you know, all these claims of victory at Tet are kind of silly from a military standpoint. Right? That would be the other point I would argue, is it wasn't a victory. It wasn't a military victory. In fact, the enemy was able to take the initiative, attack at will virtually every area of importance throughout South Vietnam. All right? Was able to invade the embassy grounds. It did not win, it did not overthrow the government, right? Which would have been, you know, its ultimate goal. But one doesn't go into a battle with just one goal. One goes into it with a series of goals and objectives. And of course, the major overriding objective would have been to create a huge public rebellion which would have overthrown the government. All right? That didn't happen, so I think that's one of the things America says they failed. But in fact, there were other objectives too. One was, in fact, to bring the war home to the United States, which Ho and Giap always, from the French period on, had used as one of their aims, to force Americans to confront the war and hopefully to increase the amount of anti-war activity going on. And they did that as a result of Tet. That's part of the legacy of it. To force people in high places to reconsider the war. And they did that. Walter Cronkite, Clark Clifford, and others like that. So the legacy of Vietnam, so the legacy of Tet, I think, is also the legacy of Vietnam. It kind of forces Americans to take all this into account. From the Vietnamese side, it's kind of interesting because Vietnamese history is highly political, just like any other countries is, but in a different way. Since 1975, there have been power struggles in Vietnam, and a lot of them have to do with kind of the North and the South, the Hanoi communist Politburo versus the kind of NLF-VC types. And so in Vietnam, it's still very muddy, but you start to see now debates on Tet as well, where different groups, depending on what faction they're in, will present Tet differently. So there actually will be Vietnamese who say, well, yeah, we got clobbered, and we had to send the North in to clean everything up and finally win this thing because the VC weren't able. Or you'll hear the opposite argument. So from the Vietnamese side, Tet is still really in play. It's highly politicized. In the end, when I said it was the definitive event, the definitive battle of the Vietnam War, I think, and we'll see this afterward, at Tet it became clear that the rationale for the war, the reasons for it, the justifications had been undermined. They'd been laid bare. Freedom and democracy, I mean, if anybody believed that, they probably didn't anymore. The government survived in South Vietnam, but it survived because of American arms. The desertion rate had grown, something that people don't talk about, but which to me is a huge problem. Catastrophic problem is the amount of refugees. How many? About 1 million more
During Tet?
During Tet.
Oh, yeah, close to 2 million more.
Almost
during
2
Tet.
million refugees go to Saigon as a result of Tet. Think of that. Think if there were some kind of crisis and 2 million people came to Houston within a 2-week period. What would that do? I mean, doesn't that kind of undermine all these claims of legitimacy and authority? 2 million. By the time, I mean, Saigon's population more than doubles just from refugees in this era. So, I mean, that's something, you know, it's kind of unspoken, but the refugee crisis is catastrophic. Yeah.
To put things in perspective, somebody has actually figured this out, and I think this is very telling. The equivalent in the United States would be 120 million refugees throughout the course of the Vietnam War. That'd be the equivalent in America.
At the time, that would have been 60% of the population. Yeah. So, I mean, imagine that. 60% of the population has to resettle. All right? Now, this is a great victory. You know, this is a military victory. The pacification program, Earl Wheeler says, pacification program in the countryside has been set back. It's been wiped out. The ARVN desertion rate is higher than ever. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers simply staying home. The average ARVN unit is at 40 to 50% strength. This is the great victory that Westmoreland and Johnson and others are publicly claiming. The idea that the United States won this huge military victory is based on the idea, again, of the body count, that the Viet Cong were so badly wiped out, that they took 40,000 losses. Well, I think Yovin Long's right. It's probably not. The numbers aren't that great. And the body count comes later, and in a sense that was due to one of the huge and one of the few tactical errors that the Hanoi leadership made, which was to throw these troops back into battle way too soon after Tet. Mini Tets in May and August really took their toll. The U.S. was far better prepared for them. They weren't on the same scale. And the Viet Cong took heavy, heavy losses at that time. And they had to go back to their sanctuaries, lick their wounds, and in about a year and a half, things would be right again for them. But in the meantime, these were, you know, very dark days for the movement, for the front. But they weren't as a result of the first Tet offensive. In fact, I mean, militarily, I don't think that it made that much of a dent. And if you look at the U.S. military's own reports out of that, the enemy's replacing its losses. They're filling them now with, in many cases, North Vietnamese rather than indigenous Southerners. Infiltration rather than recruiting is becoming far more important. But at the same time, there are people fighting. Now, maybe somebody from the North can't fight quite as effectively as somebody from the South. They don't know the area as well. They may not have the same motivation. But in fact, they're still fairly effective. And I think, you know, most people who talked about it, most people who you find giving an opinion on this in reports will say that these soldiers were better than the ARVN. I don't know. Again, I mean, that's going to be, you know, hopefully someday somebody will be able to kind of do a real comprehensive study with all kinds of Vietnamese and American sources and figure this thing out. There may be a myth, but in fact, that was clearly the stereotype, that the ARVN were not effective fighters and that the enemy, whether they be recruitees from the South or infiltrators from the North, were more effective. So the fact that it's infiltrators rather than indigenous Southerners in the big picture may not mean all that much. Right? So the legacy of Tet is still mixed. To conservatives, Walter Cronkite's the devil. I mean, you know, he proved all along he was a liberal. He was out to you know, kind of undermine the war effort. The media was out to get us, and so on and so forth. Right? But in fact, I think if you look at it militarily, if you look at it in terms of what's happening on the field, there are real serious issues that are, you know, creating grave problems. And I think even more important than that, the American ruling class just can't allow this thing to get out of hand. And it's close to that. Money is flowing out of the United States. Gold is flowing out of the United States. The economy is overheating. It's not real good for business. It's not real good for the bigger picture. And so I think all these things converge. It's an area you're going to see more and more stuff about. Most books on Tet tend to be kind of narratives, blow by blows. This is what happened here and there, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot more to it than that. When I first began studying this, you know, basically I just wanted to write about the kind of way it's been misunderstood. I think it's been misunderstood, that in fact that this was not a great victory. But then other things come into play, things like especially the economic crisis, and it just adds more and more layers to it, and you start to see what a crucial time this was. I think in the post-war period, in the post-1945 period, I can think of two times when the United States really was on edge, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis and 68 during Tet. I think those are really the two determinative crises of our time. I don't remember the missile crisis. I remember Tet as a kid, and it was pretty shaky. I mean, there was this real sense of, God, what's happening? And then, you know, Johnson in March withdraws from the presidential campaign. Martin Luther King is killed 5 days later. Bobby Kennedy's killed a couple months later. The convention in Chicago blows up. It's pretty hairy. Pete Seeger's not allowed to sing on the Smothers Brothers. So it was a pretty rough time. Anybody have any questions on this? Yes?
You haven't really touched on one of the things I found real interesting in the reading, although it's been a few weeks since I went over these chapters, but about what was going on in Hue, where they created, they had their own government there, right? The Buddhists and the South, elements of the South Vietnamese army wound up fighting each other. Isn't that right?
Yeah. The Buddhist problem never went away. You know, this conflict within the South Vietnamese government and within the South Vietnamese army between Buddhists and others never went away. And so in Hue, there's all kinds of more stuff, there's all kind of complicating factors going on internally. Later on, after kind of Tet had played its course, they found mass graves at Hue. And many of these people had like their hands tied behind their back and they'd been executed at close range. And the VC did it, and Pavin did it. There's no question about that. The numbers are still in dispute. Basically, this had always been, these atrocities had always been used as kind of political ammunition. This is what's going to happen. This is the way they are. This is what they do. The VC later would claim that the people executed had been targeted. They were fairly selected targets, village leaders and whatnot. Americans would cite the Hue massacre as kind of evidence of the need to continue the war. You can't negotiate with people like this, they're monsters, and so on and so forth. Others would point out that this is part of a much bigger and complex issue where internal dynamics, like Buddhist versus the government, are at play, where the ARVN itself was kind of involved in these kind of internecine warfares with themselves. That's the Gareth Porter article. Yeah, Porter's got a lot of flack for that. Porter kind of takes on these issues. He also wrote a refutation of the massacres in the 1950s, the myth of the bloodbath, where he says instead of thousands and thousands being killed during the agricultural collectivization, there were actually, the numbers were much smaller, between 800 and 2,000. And he does the same thing with Hue, the myth of the Hue massacre, where he points out that the Vietnamese themselves may have been responsible for a lot of this, that the enemy was not as just going around killing people randomly like others would suggest.
Did U.S. troops have to do virtually all the fighting in retaking the city? Didn't they basically kind of retake it street by street, like in World War II?
It was
in Italy?
in the Citadel. Yeah, they were fighting hand to hand. I mean, literally hand to hand combat. It was traditional war, and I mean there were others. The Marines just thought that area just wasn't that important. I mean, it has symbolic importance. It's the old capital, but by and large, I mean, a lot of people really just saw this as kind of indicative. Khe Sanh, Hue, Phu Bai, which is up there. Why are we here? And these are not areas of strategic importance. I mean, they're sending all these troops up to the north when the real war's in the south, in the Delta, in Saigon. I had a friend who was at Hue at the time who said that it was beautiful, all these old temples and whatnot, and they were just ruined and wiped out. He said it was just one of the worst things he ever saw in his life. It just was heartbreaking to see this, thousands of year-old, city, this artwork and architecture and everything just ravaged, for what reason? Yeah.
This just occurs to me, but I wonder if there's anything to this. Might Hue have been sort of the centerpiece of the strategy? I know symbolically it's important for its history. Is there something to that in terms of the Vietnamese strategy, Tet strategy, to take Hue and to keep Hue? Hue was held the longest, was it not?
By the Viet Cong, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, but I think the war in the north, I think, was essentially a deliberate ploy. It was a ruse to draw off the U.S. because they knew the U.S. would bite.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, though, that Hue is part of a systematic, countrywide attack.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if Saigon clearly is crucial in that, and Hue, I mean, Hue probably ranks up there as well, right? In terms of its
I mean,
symbolic
I still
importance.
think that the entire north. I mean, Hue is more important than Khe Sanh. But at the same time, I think that they understand that this is a way to draw off huge numbers of American troops and you know, not have to worry about it in the South where the real battle is. You know, the Tet Offensive dramatically disrupts the pacification program. It really puts a huge dent in it. And to the Vietnamese, that's way more important than Hue. I mean, you know, if they win the war, Hue is theirs anyway. So I think, you know, it's more important, and there is symbolic importance, yeah, absolutely. But, you know, LBJ had basically turned Khe Sanh into another Dien Bien Phu, so, you know, I mean, LBJ actually was making things, was playing into their hands perfectly. You know, they began Khe Sanh as a way to, and LBJ upped the ante, you know, which could, you know, basically the way LBJ handled the attacks in the north meant that the VC couldn't lose. He had turned them into these centerpieces of the entire war, which is more than they had even thought that they could get away with, which is why I think Tet was basically disastrous for the U.S. I mean, it was really mishandled. They killed a lot of enemy, no question about that. The enemy took way more losses than the ARVN and the U.S. did in every battle. Well, what did that mean? You know, what did it mean in the long run? So, I mean, yeah, Hue was important, more important than Khe Sanh, but I still think it was part of a larger objective. Okay, you know, like I said, this is real quick. Read the chapters in the reader on Tet. Marilyn Young's stuff, the chapter in Masters of War. Right. Next, we go to, as Archie Bunker would say, Richard E. Nixon, one of the, if not the dominant figures in post-war American life. For half century, Richard Nixon was in the public eye. First elected to Congress right after World War II, died in 1994. So for, you know, a 50-year period, Richard Nixon was always there. He was a red-baiting congressman and senator, vice president for 8 years under Eisenhower, failed presidential candidate in 1960, failed gubernatorial candidate in California in 1962, Republican nominee and president in 1968, re-elected in a huge landslide in 1972, only president to resign just a couple years after that, and then made a triumphant return in the late 70s and early 80s and became an elder statesman, loved by all, understood by few. Okay. Richard Nixon becomes president after the Tet Offensive. Richard Nixon is the Republican nominee in 1968. He claims that he has a secret plan to end the war. He's going to get peace with honor. Okay. Richard Nixon, as president, acts, not surprisingly, if you're at all aware of Nixon, in fairly contradictory ways. On one hand, he claims that he's going to end the war, but in fact, he expands it. He talks about Vietnamizing the war. I'll talk about that later, turning the war over to the Vietnamese, which he does, but Vietnamization is a terrible failure, and the United States continues to fight in Vietnam, continues to expend huge numbers, huge amounts of time, money, and effort in Vietnam. In the 4 years that Nixon was president, almost as many Americans died in Vietnam as under the previous administration. So a number of American casualties did not go down, despite Senator George McGovern's charge that what Nixon was trying to do was, quote, change the color of the corpses. McGovern said Nixon's plan isn't to end the war, it's to essentially make the Vietnamese die rather than the Americans. And in fact, the number of Americans dead continued to go up. So Richard Nixon is a real ambivalent figure in this. I argue that, and I title this chapter in my book, The Empire Strikes Back, because what I see happening is after Tet, after the cataclysm of Tet, the United States had to show that it was still a power, that it still had the capacity to destroy another nation. And the little quote in the reader, on the air war is really telling. The CIA analyst William K. says, unless major military operations sap a substantial proportion of North Vietnam's national effort, a degree of industrial progress is likely to be achieved that may well become a more effective means of political penetration in neighboring countries than direct military intervention. This is what John Kennedy called, with regard to Castro, the threat of a good example. Basically, if the war in Vietnam continues after Tet the way it has been, enemy victory is likely. Right? North Vietnam, even though it's been banged up pretty badly, will be able to recover, and they may actually succeed. Their economy may improve to the point where other nations in that region may want to emulate their model. And a degree of industrial progress is likely to be achieved that may well become a more effective means of political penetration in neighboring countries than direct military intervention. The threat of industrial progress in a formerly third world peasant country is probably more effective as a way to convince other people to pursue the path you choose than to actually go in militarily and force them to do so. Right? This, I think, is kind of the message of the Nixon years. You may win this, but it will be at a huge price. You may win this, but by the time it's over, rebuilding will be nearly impossible. You may win this, but you're not going to win it without the United States exacting its toll upon you. I mean, John McNaughton was talking about this stuff in '64 and '65. We will have to have gotten bloodied. We will have to have paid the price. We will have to have beaten the enemy up. That kind of thing. This also has to do with credibility. All right? If we're going to go down, we're going to take you down with us. So all of these things are part of the Nixon years. The United States, after the cataclysm of Tet, shows that it still has the capacity to inflict massive damage on another country. Okay, so even though Tet, I argue, had ended American hopes for victory in Vietnam, whatever that meant, the war itself raged on in many ways at an escalated pace. Tet may have exposed all these shortcomings, but after that, the United States continued to fight the war. They began to shift the burden of warfare to the ARVN. American troops begin to withdraw. The number of soldiers in Vietnam goes down considerably. But U.S. contributions to South Vietnam increase, weapons, money. At the same time, Nixon very cleverly is able to shift emphasis away from the American contribution to the war and thereby kind of quell the anti-war movement. Even though the two biggest demonstrations of the Vietnam era occur in the Nixon years, but after that, the anti-war movement becomes less and less a part of the public debate because Nixon has withdrawn so many troops. Nixon claims to be winding the war down, but in fact he expands it dramatically into Laos and Cambodia with direct physical interventions. Right? So in all these ways then, Nixon really is a contradictory figure, claiming to end the war, but in fact increasing it in many ways, showing overall that the United States remained a powerful country. Okay? This, in case you don't know, is a very small picture of Richard Nixon, a face that I'm sure all of you are terribly familiar with. Can't imagine many people not knowing who Nixon is, right? Richard Nixon, I mean, like I said, he's the dominant figure for 50 years. How can you say anything about him in a thumbnail sketch? He's so many different things. It's kind of ironic as I think about Nixon now. I don't know if the Republican Party would have him, frankly. And Clinton, actually, I think has a lot of Nixon in him. Richard Nixon, I mean, I talked about what he did in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. I mean, add Chile to that, add Africa to that. At the same time, Richard Nixon is the guy who created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Richard Nixon is the guy who actually increased spending on a lot of social programs. Nixon had actually a relatively progressive policy on Native Americans. Nixon's drug policy, which he never enacted, actually would have emphasized treatment and rehab rather than punishment in jail. So Nixon is kind of, in a sense, in many ways, the last liberal, as that term was understood in the 1960s and 70s. Nixon, very ambivalent in many ways, Hard to talk about him because he's so many different things. On one hand, he gladly assumed the mantle of madman. It's funny, there was the email discussion earlier about madmen in history. In fact, there was one individual who kind of, accepted that term. It was Nixon. Nixon and Kissinger deliberately would invoke this term. Kissinger would often say, look, I'm reasonable, I'd like to end this war, but Nixon's a madman, And so we better figure out some way to get over this because he may unleash an atomic bomb. Who knows what he's going to do? He's nuts. He's a madman, right? Nixon claims to have a secret plan to end the war. Whenever the media says, what is it? He, of course, says, I can't tell you. It's a secret, right? this is the tough, hard-hitting media, right? The media related, they keep talking about this, the secret war in Cambodia, which I'll get to later, which always struck me. It's a secret war in Cambodia. Secret war. They're B-52s dropping bombs in a small country. That's not a secret. The people know that they're getting hit by B-52s. But at any rate, I digress. That's Nixon. I mean, no one can deconstruct Richard Nixon. He's just too complex, too complicated, too many different things. The centerpiece of Nixon's strategy, though, would be Vietnamization. And actually, you start to see Vietnamization in the aftermath of Tet. After Tet, Westmoreland is essentially fired. He's kicked upstairs. He's brought back to Washington, and he becomes Army Chief of Staff. And he's replaced by Creighton Abrams, who becomes the commander of MAC-V. Abrams briefs a group called the Wise Men, which were a group of informal advisors, in March of 1968. And in that briefing, Abrams essentially sets out Vietnamization. This is something that the Americans for some time had wanted to do. Vietnamization, remember, is a contrast to Americanization. Remember, in July of '65, we said this is when Americanization occurred. The idea in Americanization is that the U.S. takes over the war. And a lot of military people said, we should have never done that. This was never our war. This was Vietnam's war. When you think of it, it's kind of Orwellian. You're Vietnamizing the Vietnam War. Right? So this is actually precedes Richard Nixon. I mean, Abrams was talking about this before the election is held. This is when actually LBJ is still likely to, people think he'll be the Democratic nominee. LBJ had waited his whole life to run against Richard Nixon. He thought he would tie him up in knots. He would defeat him, handily. So Vietnamization actually precedes Nixon, and it's simple. It basically means you turn responsibility for the war over to the Vietnamese, the ARVN. You leave them well equipped. You keep supporting them. You leave them with plenty of weapons. You give them training and support if they need it. You continue to fly missions in support of them, but you withdraw American troops. Why do you do this? Well, for one thing, it's cheaper. You don't have this huge army. I mean, within 2 years of assuming the White House, there are only about 120,000 Americans left in Vietnam, down from over 500,000. So it's cheaper, and it also diffuses protest at home. Nixon assumes that many people are protesting because their own butts are on the line. They could get drafted. They might be sent to Vietnam. And by Vietnamizing and withdrawing Americans, you don't have to worry about that. Nixon also changes the way young men are drafted, essentially does away with most deferments, and the selective service system goes to a lottery where 366 ping pong balls, one for each day of the year, including leap year, are thrown into a lottery, one of those boxes where everything floats around in, and they come out in order, and that's how you're drafted, right? And so Nixon essentially tries to democratize the Army that way too. And again, Creighton Abrams and the military had been advocates of this. They didn't like what was happening in Vietnam. I'll talk a little bit about soldiers later. A lot of problems with racial conflicts and discipline and drugs and so forth. Creighton Abrams said, if you're young, black, and poor, you have the right to die for your country, very sarcastically, like, these are the only people we're getting down here. So Nixon does all this stuff, and in a sense, the edge on public opposition to the war is really taken off, even though the war continues. And some of the biggest demos, as I said, the mobilization and the moratorium in '69, the post-Kent State riots in 1970 are all staggering. But after that, you really don't see as much public protest against the war. And in fact, I'm getting way ahead of the game here, but one of the more ironic polls, if you think polling data is important, occurs in May of 1970, after the invasion of Cambodia and after the Kent State killings. 65% of Americans support the invasion of Cambodia because there was a perception that he had done something. Right? Much of the opposition to the war actually comes from kind of the Nixon-George Wallace type wing, which is saying that we're opposed to the war because they're not doing anything. It's kind of a hawkish opposition to the Vietnam War. Now, ironically, after the war is over, the vast majority of Americans, and in polling, continue to believe to this day that the war was a mistake and it was morally wrong. So the data is kind of all over the place. You can basically find arguments to support anything with regard to polling on Vietnam, right? In the Nixon years, you start to see more opposition to the war, but conversely, Nixon is able to handle that way better than LBJ ever did. He's also able to do things in Vietnam that LBJ never could because of his policy of détente. Nixon is able to become more aggressive in many ways because the threat of a Soviet or Chinese intervention has been cut dramatically because Nixon makes overtures to them. Has a kind of a second period of peaceful coexistence with Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader. They sign a strategic arms limitation treaty. Opens relations with China, which of course is the great irony because Nixon as a congressman and vice president had done so much to, rip apart relations with China after Mao's victory. It begins with an exchange of ping pong teams, and it goes from there to cultural exchanges to an actual visit by Nixon and Kissinger to the People's Republic of China. So these are the two communist patrons of Vietnam, and so Nixon can do things without having to worry about the Soviet Union and the Chinese. LBJ didn't have those kinds of options, so he's very clever that way too. Nixon was quite astute, quite sharp. I mean, clearly, unlike many politicians of this post-war period, when you think of, Reagan, who was never going to be mistaken for a Rhodes Scholar, compared to Nixon, I mean, there's quite a stunning contrast. Nixon was fairly sharp, and in many ways totally amoral, which made him even more effective. And I mean, Kissinger would be the first one to say that. And if you can't believe Henry Kissinger on morality, who can you believe, right? So Vietnamization, yeah.
Did Nixon also begin or float the idea of the 18-year-old vote at that same time? Because that, I think, was very significant, at least an image of trying to get those that were fighting this thing to at least have some say in it.
Yeah, yeah. The amendment, I think, became effective in 1971. Yeah, that occurred when he was president. He tried to reach out. He wasn't terribly good at it, as you know, and we'll mention, like the mall where he goes out there and talks about football and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, you can see, again, you can look at Nixon and see a lot of different things in him. You can look at him and see, in many ways, a guy who was not inconsistent with the liberalism of the post-World War II era. In some ways, liberalism dies in 1968. King is killed, Kennedy is killed, Humphrey loses the election, but Nixon doesn't gut the system. I mean, he couldn't have. I don't think he could have, but.
What was the name of the secretary of, the guy who resigned rather than fire Cox? Was it Richardson?
Elliot Richardson,
Elliot
Bill Ruckelshaus
Richardson.
house.
Yeah, I read an interview with Elliot Richardson
Yeah.
in a magazine where he pointed out that actually the policies, the domestic policies of the Nixon administration were to the left of where Clinton is now.
Oh, I would agree with that. I would agree with that absolutely. Clinton would have been a Nixon Republican, and I don't know if Nixon would have a place in the Republican Party today. Oh, absolutely. But at the same time, Nixon was not averse to using very harsh racial terms. The tapes coming out, he talks about, uses the N-word, talks about Jews in very disparaging terms. So did Eisenhower, so did LBJ.
Which N-word are people? It's funny how it always kills me, but the N-word. And you
Yes.
think, well, no, naughty, knucklehead.
It's funny because, if somebody would use the term Dago, I would have no problem in describing that.
Well,
I just don't want it to be misunderstood and have somebody think I'm saying it.
And I think if we're referring, in fact, to the word nigger, then the impact of what you've just told us about this man's use of the word nigger, that if you say, or we say, the N-word, that really serves to lessen and minimize, the racism and the reality of what someone said, and it just try.
I agree with you.
Because
I'm gun shy for a particular reason because the first time I ever did that, I thought I set it up and point out that I was quoting somebody, and a student thought that was me using the term, and I had to sit down and in great detail explain that this was a quote from somebody else. It was not a term I used. So, but Nixon would call people that quite clearly. He was not afraid. In fact, he and Agnew had a skit they did at the Gridiron Club publicly where they sat down and they played Dixie at the piano, alternating back and forth with kind of a step and fetch it routine going on. So, I mean, Nixon kind of had it all over the place. he apparently did not. I mean, LBJ, kind of threw that around all the time. There's I think I said the famous Chad Mitchell trio thing where, they're teaching LBJ how to say Negro instead of nigger because, he would call King that. Did I mention in this class or another class with the Roger Wilkins story, where after the riots in '65, he calls a meeting. Roger Wilkins is a African American, and he's sitting around and he says, "All those and he sees Wilkins there, and he's about to say it, rioting.
Roy Wilkins? Or
No, Roger Wilkins.
Roger?
Wilkins, who's a historian at George Mason. But he stops in mid-sentence, kind of like Mel Brooks does with Cleavon Little in Blazing Saddles. Do you know the new sheriff is a...
Or actually, it's Nigra.
Nigra, yeah.
Nigrah. And it's kind of, it's a hybrid.
Yeah. And Nixon was not averse to playing those kinds of throwing those kind of racial epithets out either. But he's the guy who kind of invented black Republicans, at the same time. He thought, hey, this is a marketing tool. So he's kind of all over the place. And who else could run with both Will Chamberlain and Sammy Davis Jr., but Richard Nixon, and Elvis. So this guy was hip, man. Chamberlain, and Nixon were buddies, as was Sammy. But Nixon, there actually was a tradition in the Republican Party where things like civil rights were actually part of the agenda. The Republicans used to be, a long time ago, the party of Lincoln. So in the early 60s, it wasn't at all unusual to see people like Nixon or Rockefeller having what were considered fairly progressive ideas about civil rights and race. It was the Southern Democrats who were the obstructionists. So political system, you try to talk to survey courses with people who are 18 or 19, and it's just real hard to explain because to them, the South is this Republican place, and the Democrats are all, this party of black Americans and so on and so forth. And you try to tell them, this is pretty new. This is all pretty new. That, there wasn't a Republican to be found in the South in 1966. There weren't any. They had to invent them. And, how the Democrats actually were the party of segregation, and the Republicans actually had a pretty good record on civil rights. And all this stuff is just like, very mind-boggling. So, yeah.
Where did that quote from the CIA guy that's in the reading on the air war, how did that surface? Because when I read that, I felt like I'd found like one of the smoking guns here.
Yeah.
And you can actually, by the logic of that quote, the U.S., you could say that the U.S., even though they lost the war, succeeded in their objective.
Yeah.
They so totally destroyed North Vietnam that it could never be a positive example for other third world nations.
Someone just posted that, and this is something I want to talk about at the end. It's an argument that Noam Chomsky made, one of the first, basically that the U.S. won the war. And there's a debate among left scholars about that, and like Marilyn Young and Noam Chomsky, for instance. I agree with Chomsky. I was sold as soon as I saw that Pepsi Cola had sponsored the 20th anniversary, 1995. Pepsi was the official sponsor. That's all I needed to hear. The 20th anniversary of the success of the war, 1975. It ended in 1975. 20th anniversary of victory of the Vietnam War was sponsored by Pepsi. In Vietnam. Not here. Yeah, in Vietnam. I'm trying to find the quote. Was there a quote? Was there a note? I don't know where it is now. We can find it later. I don't think that, I think that quote's important because it's fairly candid, but I think that you see that attitude, which is fairly prevalent. And in fact, I think the U.S. won in that regard.
The CIA might have looked at it that way from day one, from Dien Bien Phu,
Well, McNaughton said something to this effect in 1964. There's a memo by Max Taylor, which I remember reading, and I hope I can find sometime. I don't remember where I put this stuff. But Taylor, in 1964, has a list of basically three objectives. And one is to defeat the communist conspiracy or something like that. The other one is to, preserve freedom in South Vietnam. But the third one is, basically it's this, to crush them, to hurt them so badly that they can't do anything if they do win. I don't think this is, I don't think this is really that far out. A lot of people will dismiss it unless you have a smoking gun. And this ain't going to do. This is just the CIA analyst. They would want to see, if you're predisposed not to believe that kind of thing, Americans would never do that. They would never fight a war and put people's lives at risk just to crush the enemy and make it difficult for them to rebuild. So if you're predisposed to believe that, then it's going to be hard to convince somebody otherwise. All right. Back to Richard E. Nixon. I just love saying that. I don't know if anybody else gets a kick out of it. Whenever Archie Bunker said that, I thought it was the funniest thing. Richard E. Nixon. we're past the 30-minute mark, which is like the official time that I get loopy in this class, okay? So just bear with me, all you out there. Okay, you might want to hit your pause button, take a break right now. Vietnamization, which I think I mentioned 10, 15 minutes ago, is the keystone to this. Basically, the idea is that by turning over the war to the Vietnamese, you can continue to fight and grind down the enemy. Henry Kissinger says, I refuse to believe that a little fourth-rate power like North Vietnam does not have a breaking point. I think I mentioned to you before that Ngo Vinh Long was a teaching assistant to Kissinger at Harvard, and Ngo Vinh Long would keep telling him, look, these people aren't going to quit, and Kissinger was very dismissive of Ngo Vinh Long. Of course, every society has a breaking point where they'll give up. You know, did London have a breaking point in 1940, 41? Oh, but you know, that didn't really kind of sink in. So it's kind of funny they would use history fairly selectively. So what does Vietnamization mean? The U.S. increased the size of the ARVN to 1 million by 1970. The ARVN, I believe, was the fourth largest army in the world by 1970. 1 million soldiers in arms. They provided the ARVN with 1 million M16 rifles, 12,000 M60 machine guns, 40,000 M79 grenade launchers, 2,000 heavy mortars and howitzers. Okay, they were loaded for bear. This is more than you'd find at an NRA convention. I'm sure I just offended somebody out there. So, okay. At the same time, the CIA begins Operation Phoenix, which was a program to locate people who were considered VC leaders. It was a program to, quote, neutralize them. It was an assassination program. Between 25 and 30,000 Vietnamese were killed during Phoenix. One reporter said it was a program of calculated brutality. Basically, Phoenix succeeded because it killed so many people that it was bound to bag a lot of VC as a result of it. It's kind of like, you know, you spray enough shot in the air, you're going to hit a duck. I mean, you kill enough people and you're bound to kill VC, so Phoenix did have an impact that way. One CIA official said Phoenix was thought of by geniuses but implemented by idiots. It was essentially an assassination program. It was supposed to target kind of VC higher-ups, but it didn't. And it's kind of funny, again, because people always say the Viet Cong, you know, used force and coercion and violence. And they did. I mean, they would target village officials, the local tyrant and whatnot, and kill them. But they kind of leave Phoenix out of the equation, which is the flip side of that. Phoenix killed a lot more people in terms of locating and targeting folks than the Viet Cong did, because it was fairly indiscriminate. And in fact, it turned a lot of people against, which is not an unknown story, turned a lot of people against, even more against the U.S. Than that. So what Vietnamization is supposed to end the war, it's supposed to wind down the war. Vietnamization actually becomes a way to reduce the number of American soldiers, but actually through technology increase the war. It was an unbridled use of technology, especially air power. The war shifts from the U.S. perspective to something that is almost, not exclusively, but principally an air war. Okay? And what else does Vietnamization do? It expands rather than winds the war down. Right? I want to go back here. I talked a little bit about this before and talk about a couple of the sideshows because I think these are good examples of Vietnamization. The wars, we've talked almost exclusively about the war in Vietnam, but there are conflicts going on in Laos and Cambodia as well. Very similar. In Laos, you have an insurgency. Remember, we talked about this several weeks ago. The Pathet Lao versus the government. And in Cambodia, you have an insurgency. A group of communists called the Khmer Rouge versus the government, which was run at the time by Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Okay? In both of those countries, then, you have insurgencies, and at the same time, the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Rouge are both communists, right? In both of those countries, you also have American intervention, essentially through air power. The United States unleashes some of the most sustained bombing in the history of warfare, essentially through the use of B-52s. There are a couple pictures of B-52s there, which are long-range bombers, staggering, huge. Yeah,
What was their payload?
I have it here, actually. 84 500-pound and 24 750-pound bombs, and they could saturate an area of 2 square miles. So that's quick math. 84 and 24 is 118. Does that sound right? Okay. Silence implies consent. It's 118 bombs, 500 and 750-pound bombs.
150 tons?
You do the math on that one. I agree with you, sure. Let's see, 84 times 500. Well, that's whatever.
He has
That's
a
21 tons.
calculator,
He has a calculator,
Professor.
I'm
Yes,
sure you're
I just
right.
thought I'd let you,
You
know
win.
that.
Oh, it is? No, actually, I don't think it's quite that much, but it's a lot. Okay, 84 times 500 is 21 tons. And 24 750-pound bombs is about 9 tons. So you're looking at about 30 tons of bombs. Yeah. Beginning in 1964 through 1969, the U.S. actually unleashed a torrent of B-52s on Laos. In 5 years, the United States, and again, this map not only doesn't have case on, but it doesn't have, there's an area in Laos, kind of around here, called the Plain of Jars, Plain des Jars in French. The Plain of Jars, in 5 years, the B-52s dropped over 150,000 tons, 150,000 tons, which is 3 million pounds, I believe, of bombs in an area over here, which was a Pathet Lao stronghold, the Plain of Jars, right here, okay? This area alone, 150,000 tons of bombs. One United Nations official said the intensity of the bombing was such that no organized life was possible in the villages, okay? So the United States from 64 to 69 into the Nixon years is conducting an air war throughout Laos, especially in the northeast here, which tended to be Pathet Lao areas. Okay, we will pick up next time I see the red light flashing, which is a clear signal for me to shut up. Okay, so let me do that. I didn't time it well. I won't be renewed next year. I'll go the way.